A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black CEO with a seatbelt buckle. Seconds later, the CEO's comeback left the entire plane in stunned silence. He thought yanking a seatbelt in a man's face would show control. He didn't realize the man he mocked could end his entire career with a single call. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets its match. The moment Dr. Kieran Maddox reached out for the napkins, the air between him and the flight attendant thinned into something sharp. "Excuse me," Kieran said calmly, gesturing to the beverage cart where a stack of napkins lay folded beside the sparkling waters. "May I get a few of those napkins? I'll be setting up my laptop." Darren Hale turned his head with mechanical precision, the practiced smile on his face failing to reach his eyes. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, staring, as if weighing Kieran's request against some invisible scale of tolerance. Then, slowly, he picked up 2 napkins and dropped them onto Kieran's tray with an almost theatrical flick. "Certain people always need more," Darren muttered, just loud enough for it not to be accidental. Kieran froze, mid-motion. He had heard comments like that before, muted tones, coded language wrapped in thin civility. But there was something unusually brazen about this one. He looked up, locking eyes with the man. Darren's smile had vanished now, his lips drawn in a tight, professional line. But the damage was done. The words hung there like smoke, curling between them. Kieran didn't rise to it. Not yet. He adjusted the napkins, folded one beneath the base of his laptop, and settled into his seat, determined not to allow this moment to control him. Years of navigating high-pressure meetings and subtle bias in boardrooms had taught him that silence could be sharper than outrage. The cabin around him buzzed softly, heels clicking down the aisle, wheels thumping as overhead compartments closed, distant announcements muffled through static. But for Kieran, everything had gone slightly dimmer, like a filter had been placed over his senses. He didn't feel paranoid. He felt targeted. From the corner of his eye, he watched Darren continue his routine, greeting other passengers with robotic cheer, ensuring their comfort with the energy of someone trying to be watched. Yet, each time Darren passed his row, the man's eyes lingered half a second too long. Calculating. Kieran's instincts began to stir. He glanced out the window at the tarmac, the sun throwing long golden streaks across the fuselage of nearby aircraft. The boarding bridge detached with a jolt, and moments later, the engines hummed to life beneath them. The plane began to taxi. Kieran's fingers hovered above his keyboard, then slowly pulled back. He couldn't focus on documents now, not with that strange knot in his chest tightening. It wasn't fear. It was caution, alertness, a feeling honed not by paranoia, but by experience. As the jet lifted from the runway, pressing passengers back into their seats, Kieran tried to relax into the leather cushion. But he couldn't stop replaying Darren's expression, the strange blend of superiority and restraint, as if he were holding back something darker. The lights dimmed as the cabin crew prepared for service. Darren reappeared near the front, offering water to a passenger 2 rows ahead. His voice was clear, professional, even friendly. But when he reached Kieran again, the mask slipped. "Sir," he said, his tone unusually clipped, "is everything all right with your seatbelt?" "You seem..." Unsettled, Kieran blinked. "No issue. Just preparing to work." "Good," Darren replied with a smile that didn't match his eyes. "Wouldn't want any disruptions today." He moved on, but the words rang oddly, as if layered with meaning. Kieran's thoughts churned beneath his calm surface. Why the antagonism? He wasn't being difficult. He hadn't raised his voice. He wasn't asking for special treatment. Yet something about his presence, his suit, his composure, his very identity, seemed to provoke Darren into subtle hostility. Maybe Darren didn't even fully understand it himself. Or maybe he did. Kieran glanced around. Most of the other passengers had already buried themselves in books, podcasts, or idle gazes out the window. No one was watching. No one noticed the exchange. That's how it always began, small slights in quiet spaces, Hard to prove, easy to dismiss. He reached for his water and paused. His palm hovered above the tray table, fingers slightly curled. He didn't want to spill, didn't want to give any reason for Darren to return. That's when the thought struck him. Not every storm announced itself with thunder. The edge of the seatbelt buckle sliced across Dr. Kieran Maddox's palm before he had a chance to brace. The metal was cold, quick, and deliberate. A clean gash opened beneath his skin, a crimson line blooming instantly across the flesh and trailing toward his wrist. The pain was immediate, sharp, stinging, and humbling. He blinked once, not from shock, but from restraint. A breath caught in his chest. Darren Hale, the lead flight attendant, straightened as though nothing had happened. His fingers lingered a fraction too long on the seatbelt latch, his movements rehearsed and meticulous. He looked down at Kieran with a performance smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "Accidents happen," Darren said smoothly, his voice soft enough to sound professional, but thinly veiled with satisfaction. He gave a slight shrug, as if he'd just spilled a drop of water, not sliced a man's hand open mid-flight. Kieran's jaw tightened. He turned his hand over and examined the gash under the cabin lights. Blood was already pooling into his palm, running across the veins like red ink over blue lines. A single drop fell onto his blue suit pants. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. His mind focused, already assembling the pieces of what just happened and what it could become. Other passengers in the front rows glanced around, confused by the subtle tension but unaware of the actual moment. From their angle, Darren had merely leaned over to help a passenger with a faulty seatbelt. They hadn't seen the wrist twist, the precise flick of the metal edge. Kieran had, and more importantly, he had felt it. He reached for a napkin from the side tray, the movement calm, calculated. He folded it once, pressed it against the wound, and applied pressure. Darren stepped back, walking away without another word, his posture proud, as if he had just asserted authority in a subtle contest no one else was invited to witness. Kieran stared ahead, his pulse even, but his thoughts racing. He had dealt with boardroom betrayals, corporate backstabbing, and racial microaggressions wrapped in politeness. But this was physical. This was different, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. The turbulence came shortly after, shaking the cabin slightly. Overhead, bins rattled gently. The captain's voice crackled overhead, giving reassurance. But Kieran barely heard it. He was watching Darren as he moved down the aisle. The attendant's performance continued. Smiles for the elderly couple in row 1C, polite nods to the businessman with his tablet in 2A, but when he reached Kieran again, his expression stiffened. He offered nothing. Not a bandage. Not a word. Kieran shifted in his seat and pressed harder against the wound, the napkin now stained a deep red. He considered pressing the call button. But what would that achieve? Darren was the lead attendant. Any report would pass through him first. Kieran understood the game being played. You didn't shout during the opening move. You watched. You calculated. Moments later, Darren returned, not with concern but with cold precision. He leaned in under the guise of rechecking the seatbelt latch, his hand again dangerously close to Kieran's torso. His breath carried the faint scent of mints and menace. "You still think it's jammed?" Darren asked under his breath, fingers brushing the belt again. "Or maybe you just need help learning how to use it." Kieran didn't respond. His eyes locked with Darren's for a single, burning second. That was all it took. He saw it then, behind the mask of professionalism, a glint of cruelty, not born of stress, but entitlement. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, Darren leaned closer and whispered with surgical intent, "Maybe you're just using it wrong." The words sliced deeper than the buckle had. Kieran's grip tightened on the armrest, but his expression remained composed. The years had trained him well, not to flinch, not to raise his voice, not to let men like Darren rewrite the narrative by baiting him into fury. He had learned that composure was power, and right now, That power would be his weapon. Without a word, Darren stood straight and walked away again, his shoulders squared like a man proud of a battle won. Kieran let him go. Let him believe it. The napkin, now soaked with blood, sat heavily in his lap. He pulled another, folded it tightly, and wrapped it around his palm. His mind worked through scenarios. How to document this? How to make sure this moment didn't disappear into someone else's version of events? He reached slowly for his smartwatch. One silent press activated the voice recording feature. The soft chime confirmed it had begun. He laid the device casually on the tray table. Screen dimmed. The cabin returned to stillness. But Kieran's thoughts surged forward like a current beneath ice. The flight would be hours long. But this was no longer about reaching Novan City. It was about drawing the line, about revealing the truth without shouting. He had no intention of letting Darren control the story. He looked once more at his palm, the gash stark, the blood now clotting slightly. His eyes lifted toward the aisle Darren had just disappeared down. He would not confront. Not yet. He would build. And as the engines hummed and the clouds drifted beneath them, Kieran thought, sometimes cruelty hides behind uniforms. Kieran pressed the napkin hard against his bleeding hand, the sting radiating up his arm like a warning siren. Darren had already vanished down the aisle, striding toward the front of the cabin with theatrical urgency. The sound of his shoes on the carpeted floor was deliberate, meant to draw attention. And it did. Within seconds, a static-laced voice rang out from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Darren's voice declared, faux composed, "we are handling an incident of passenger aggression in row 3A. Please remain seated and calm." Kieran's jaw tightened. That lie wasn't just self-preservation, it was a weapon. One sharpened and flung with precision to turn the room against him before he even had a chance to speak. Around him, heads turned. He felt the weight of glances, uncertain, speculative, judgmental. No one had seen the buckle slash. They'd only seen the blood, and now they'd heard the official version first. Kieran didn't move. His heartbeat pounded behind his eyes, but his face remained unreadable. Panic, he knew, was what Darren expected. Outbursts could be twisted. Resistance could be repackaged. But silence, composed, calculating silence, was harder to control. He reached with his uninjured hand, slowly, methodically, and activated the recording app on his smartwatch. The quiet beep was lost beneath the cabin hum. He set the watch on the tray table, angled slightly, looking like nothing more than a passenger checking the time, but the microphone was live. Every breath, every word would now be documented. Moments later, Darren returned, his posture rigid with rehearsed concern. He walked slowly, as if he were the one maintaining order after chaos. When he reached Kieran's row, he paused, standing just out of arm's reach. His hands were clasped before him, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the performance. "For safety reasons," Darren said, voice tight, "you're instructed to remain seated until we land, or the captain advises otherwise." Kieran's eyes met his, calm, focused. "You injured me. Don't make this worse." There was a flicker, so quick it almost vanished, the tiniest crack in Darren's composure. His lip twitched, his shoulders lifted a breath too high, but he recovered. Turning slightly toward another crew member near the galley, he spoke just loud enough for nearby ears to catch. He grabbed at the seatbelt. Tried to pull it free. It was a simple lie, but dangerous. Lies didn't need to be believed by everyone, only enough to plant doubt. And doubt had already begun to sprout in the cabin. A man 2 rows ahead leaned to whisper something to his seatmate. Someone else discreetly pulled out their phone, angling it subtly to capture what might come next. Kieran's hand throbbed, blood soaking through the napkin, but he didn't flinch. His mind ticked like clockwork. This wasn't just about the injury anymore. This was a framing in real time. And, like any good strategist, he knew the battle wasn't won by reaction, but by positioning. The second crewman, A younger man with a trim beard and uncertain eyes stepped forward. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked, clearly torn between protocol and curiosity. Kieran didn't answer right away. He looked at the man's name tag, R-Y-A-N. His voice, when it came, was even and unshaken. "I followed every instruction given," Kieran said, "but I'd like the captain to be informed that I was injured by this man, deliberately." Darren scoffed, too loud. "Now he's making accusations." Ryan blinked, caught between superiors, but Kieran noticed something in the man's expression. He hadn't expected an accusation, and he hadn't denied the injury. "Is that blood?" Ryan asked, eyes dropping to Kieran's hand. Darren stepped in quickly. He grabbed at the buckle. Injured himself in the struggle, Ryan hesitated. That hesitation was a crack. Kieran didn't press. He let the silence fill the space. Let Ryan see Darren's too perfect defense. Let the contradiction sit and rot. The truth, Kieran knew, didn't need to shout. It just needed space to breathe. From the other side of the aisle, a voice murmured, "I thought I saw something, but I wasn't sure." The whisper was small, but Darren heard it. His eyes darted toward the source. His smile thinned. His performance had limits, and those limits were now showing. Kieran leaned back into his seat, the napkin pressed tighter, blood seeping in dark lines between his fingers. The pain grounded him, focused him. Every second the recording ran, every word captured, tightened the noose around the lie. He had come onto this flight as a CEO bound for a merger. Now he was something else, a witness, a plaintiff, maybe more. And he wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't curse or lash out. He'd let Darren continue spinning his web until he choked on it. Kieran looked out the window briefly. Clouds drifted by in peaceful defiance of the storm brewing in the cabin. Inside, a war of narratives raged. But only one side had evidence. He adjusted the smartwatch slightly, making sure its face pointed directly toward the aisle. He wouldn't win this fight with volume. He would win it with proof. When truth becomes invisible, patience turns into a weapon. The buckle hovered inches from Kieran's face. "Still think you can handle this on your own?" Darren whispered, his voice venomous, his breath sharp with the faint sting of coffee and contempt. His hand remained unnervingly steady, the seatbelt's metal tongue gleaming under the cabin lights, catching the crimson reflection from the bloodied napkin in Kieran's hand. Kieran didn't flinch, but inside, his mind braced against a rising storm. Every calculation he'd made since stepping on this plane now shifted. This wasn't just verbal hostility or professional sabotage. This was personal, deliberate, violent. He glanced quickly around. Passengers behind were engrossed in their conversations or screens. To the right, a man had headphones on. No one saw the buckle's threat. No one heard the mockery. But someone would. Kieran's eyes dropped to the weapon in Darren's hand, because that's what it had become now. A tool repurposed for humiliation. His palm throbbed beneath the pressed napkin, warm and sticky with blood that had already begun soaking through. The pain was sharp, but the insult sharper. He had seen restraint turned into an excuse before, in conference rooms and courtrooms alike. But here, in a sealed metal tube 30,000 feet in the air, that restraint had to evolve. It had to become something else. "Go ahead," Darren muttered again, the buckle now grazing Kieran's cheek as though testing his threshold. "I'll say you lunged." They'll believe me. That's when the idea clicked. Clear, sharp, like a code executing with perfect timing. Kieran's left hand moved. Smooth, controlled, a practiced motion from someone who'd handled fragile prototypes and volatile contracts. He reached for Darren's wrist, not with anger, but with precision. His fingers coiled around the man's forearm, not tight, but certain. The shock in Darren's eyes was brief, just a flicker. Then Kieran rotated the wrist, pivoted the buckle in one clean arc, and with a sudden jerk, jammed the metal latch straight into Darren's open mouth. The clasp snapped shut against his teeth with a high-pitched click, cold and final. Darren's eyes bulged. His body reeled backward. He let out a muffled, panicked moan, choking on shock and metal. His hand scrambled to unfasten the clasp now biting into his jaw, but it was locked, tight and unforgiving. His legs stumbled into the aisle wall, his head jerking side to side like a cornered animal. Gasps erupted. A woman in the back half stood. A businessman dropped his phone. Somewhere, a child cried out, unsure of what had just happened but sensing fear. Kieran remained still. He sat straight, spine aligned, chest rising and falling with quiet purpose. His wounded hand, slick with blood, now rested on his lap. He didn't follow Darren's retreat. He didn't shout, didn't rise. He had made his move, and it had been surgical. Final. One of the junior attendants dashed down the aisle, wide-eyed. "What happened?" he stammered, reaching Darren too late to stop the stumbling. Darren clutched at the buckle, his face red with panic, the latch still fixed inside his mouth like a gag forged from his own weapon. A wet string of blood and spit dripped from his lip. Kieran didn't answer the attendant. Instead, he looked straight ahead. His breathing was calm, but his mind burned through every consequence. Would they believe he was provoked? Would the cameras record the moment clearly? Would the narrative, so often stolen, finally remain intact? The other passengers whispered now, uncertain of what they'd seen. Half of them had caught the tail end, Darren stumbling, Kieran sitting, blood and metal as silent witnesses. The first officer radioed in from the cockpit, asking for status. Another attendant responded shakily. We've had a situation in first class." The tension became a fog, thick and clinging. No one dared move. Time stretched into a frozen frame. Kieran didn't regret what he'd done, but he knew what it would cost. And yet, in that moment, he felt something click, not just in the buckle but deep within his sense of purpose. This wasn't about proving worth. This wasn't about teaching Darren a lesson. This was about shifting the axis of power, reclaiming a narrative so often hijacked. Darren gagged again, the muffled sound echoing down the narrow aisle. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the buckle's release tab. Kieran turned to face him one last time, his expression unreadable. The attendant finally managed to release the clasp, and Darren crumpled, coughing, saliva streaking his chin. Silence followed, dense and uncomfortable. Passengers who hadn't noticed the blood before now saw it staining the seat, the floor, Kieran's cuff. The buckle, the very symbol of safety, had become a blade. And now it had become justice. Kieran leaned back slightly, exhausted but resolute. Justice, he thought, watching Darren writhe, sometimes is the sound of metal closing. Darren reeled backward, choking on the buckle still wedged between his teeth, the sharp metallic click still echoing faintly in the stunned silence. The moment held, like the suspended breath of a storm, before everything shattered. A co-attendant named Marvin burst down the aisle, stumbling slightly as he rushed toward them. "Step back! Step back!" he shouted, shoving himself between Darren and Kieran. His hands moved fast, one pressing Darren to the side, the other waving frantically toward the flight phone. "Get the captain on the line now!" Across the cabin, passengers erupted in whispers and rising voices. A man in seat 3C stood halfway, uncertain whether to help or retreat. Two others pulled out their phones, capturing fragments of the chaos. "Did you see that?" someone murmured. "What happened?" "He just attacked the flight attendant." "No, I think the attendant cut him first." Confusion twisted through the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to clear. Kieran remained seated. Blood soaked into the napkin clutched in his palm, dripping in small, steady drops onto the fabric of his trousers and the carpet below. But his face held no panic, only a chilling stillness. His breath came low and measured. His thoughts moved even faster than his pulse. He didn't move toward Darren. He didn't argue. He simply let the chaos whirl around him while he sat in the eye of it, calculating. From the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled overhead. "This is Captain Rayner. We're declaring an in-air disturbance. We will be diverting to Braxton Regional. Cabin crew, initiate emergency landing protocol. Both individuals involved are to be restrained until ground personnel can restrain him." Kieran's eyes flicked toward Marvin, who was now helping Darren stand. The buckle still dangled from the corner of the attendant's mouth, coated in blood and saliva. Darren spat it out with a pained groan, clutching his jaw. His eyes darted toward Kieran, not with fury, but with fear. And then, under the weight of the noise, the adrenaline, and his own crumbling mask, Darren muttered the words that would change everything. "He was supposed to just stay quiet," he hissed to Marvin, who barely registered it over the noise. Darren's hands trembled as he wiped his mouth. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Kieran heard it. The recorder on his smartwatch, still quietly running from the tray table, heard it too. Kieran didn't react. He didn't flinch. He let Darren's words drift into the air like ashes from a fire too long hidden. The confession wasn't shouted. It wasn't performed. It was panicked. Raw. True. And that made it undeniable. Marvin turned to Kieran, his voice clipped and anxious. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay seated and keep your hands visible. Medical staff will be waiting at landing. I'm not resisting," Kieran said calmly, holding up his bloodied hand, "but I want this recorded." His voice was low but firm. He gestured slightly toward the smartwatch. "Everything from the past 20 minutes is on there. Everything Marvin blinked, caught off guard." "What are you?" "Tell your team," Kieran said, eyes not leaving Darren's hunched figure, "to check the audio." Just then, a junior attendant named Brent arrived with a medical kit. "We need to clean the wound before landing," he said, kneeling beside Kieran. The smell of antiseptic stung the air. "No," Kieran said quietly. "Leave the blood." "Let them see it." Brent paused, then nodded slowly. "I'll stay with you until we land." The plane shuddered slightly as the descent began. Oxygen masks didn't fall, but the pressurized silence in the cabin felt no less suffocating. Passengers avoided eye contact. Some stared at Kieran, others at Darren. No one spoke now. The cabin wasn't a flight anymore. It had become a courtroom without walls, where every second was evidence. As the wheels lowered and the runway came into view, Kieran stared out the window, his hand resting on the tray, the blood-stained napkin loose between his fingers. He could hear Darren's shallow breaths a few rows away, could feel Marvin's suspicious gaze still flickering back toward him. But none of that mattered anymore. The damage was done, but so was the proof. Kieran's wound pulsed in time with the landing gear's roar. He didn't wince. He didn't smile. His only action was a whisper, barely louder than the jet engines outside as he turned to Brent. "Make sure someone listens to that recording," he said. "It matters more than you think." The plane touched down in a sharp jolt, the tires screaming against the tarmac. Emergency vehicles flanked the runway. Flashing lights blurred against the windows, bathing the cabin in strobes of red and blue. No one applauded. No one clapped for landing. Silence stretched like a verdict being written, and as the aircraft rolled toward its designated stop, Kieran finally allowed himself one breath of reflection, not of victory, but of preparation. Sometimes, he thought, his eyes narrowing, survival is not about strength, but about what you make others hear. The plane's wheels screeched against the tarmac as Flight 612 made its emergency landing at Braxton Regional Airport. The cabin jolted slightly before settling into an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that follows a storm but precedes judgment. Through the windows, flashing red and blue lights flickered. Emergency vehicles and airport security fanned out across the runway like a silent tribunal awaiting testimony. Within moments, uniformed officers ascended the jet bridge, stepping into the tense, pressurized cabin. Dr. Kieran Maddox sat still in his seat, his bright blue suit stained with blood, both dried and fresh. His hand, tightly wrapped in a napkin that had long since soaked through, rested on the armrest. His face betrayed no panic, only a deliberate stillness. Across the cabin, near the galley, Darren Hale sat slumped and restrained, the seatbelt buckle still wedged tightly between his teeth. His lip was swollen, his shirt wrinkled from his earlier struggle, and his eyes burned with the fury of humiliation. The metal glinted between his teeth as he mumbled something unintelligible, muffled by both pain and shame. "That's him!" Darren suddenly shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with accusatory force. "He assaulted me. He's dangerous." One of the officers, a tall man with a buzz cut and a nameplate that read Rains, stepped cautiously toward Kieran. His hand hovered near his sidearm, his posture tense. He looked from Kieran's composed figure to Darren's more visibly injured one and made a judgment based on appearances, until a voice cut through the tension. "Sir," a paramedic said urgently, intercepting Rains before he could act. The medic, a young man named Jacob, had already attended briefly to Kieran's hand minutes earlier and now held out something small but significant. A smartwatch, still recording, its screen blinking quietly. "You may want to hear this first." The officer took the device, skeptical but compliant, and tapped the playback icon. Darren's voice filled the cabin, unmistakable and unguarded. "He was supposed to just stay quiet. I didn't mean for it to go this far." A ripple passed through the cabin. Some passengers who had only seen fragments of the earlier confrontation now leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. Others turned slowly to face Darren, whose earlier bravado melted into a flicker of panic. His mouth opened, as if to deny what they all just heard, but the buckle was still locked between his teeth, clamping his words into incoherent grunts. The officer's brow furrowed as the audio continued. The playback revealed more than just the confession. It captured Darren's earlier taunts, the manipulation of the intercom, and the calculated lie to his crew members. The lies layered one after another, unfolding like a stack of cards that could no longer support their own weight. "Is this time-stamped?" Officer Rains asked, his voice low and suddenly respectful. Kieran nodded. "From the moment he called me aggressive. Everything's there." The officer turned to his partner, a stocky man named Wells, and gave a sharp nod. Without a word, Wells approached Darren and began unfastening the restraints, not to release him, but to reposition them behind his back. Darren protested, spitting fragments of blood and metal as the buckle was finally removed, but the damage had been done. His protests lacked force. His voice, so commanding earlier in the flight, now quivered with helplessness. Passengers murmured as the tide turned. Those who had watched passively were no longer unsure. A man in row 2C, a business traveler with a loosened tie, shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." He tried to flip the whole thing. Kieran remained quiet, his breathing controlled, his pulse steady despite the ache in his bandaged hand. When Officer Rains approached him again, his tone had shifted entirely. "Dr. Maddox, do you require medical transport?" "I'll walk," Kieran replied softly. "But I'd prefer privacy from the press. And I want this recorded chain of custody preserved." "You have my word." As the crew began ushering passengers off the aircraft row by row, a strange reversal took hold. Earlier, eyes had been watching Kieran with suspicion, curiosity, uncertainty. Now, those same eyes glanced at him with silent admiration, some even with guilt for having doubted him. A man from across the aisle gave a subtle nod of respect. Another whispered, "That's what calm looks like." Darren, now fully restrained and led down the aisle by officers, refused to meet anyone's gaze. His pride had bled out faster than Kieran's palm ever had. The loudest sound around him now was the soft metallic click of the seatbelt buckle, still ringing in his ears from where it had locked between his teeth. As Kieran stood and followed the medics down the jet bridge, the flight's empty silence echoed behind him. The truth had not shouted. It had waited, and in that waiting, it had found its moment to speak with undeniable clarity. The truth doesn't shout, It waits for silence to expose the liar. The recording clicked off. Kieran Maddox sat still, his back straight against the cold metal of the airport security office chair. A sterile hum from the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed just above the edge of hearing, but he tuned it out. Across from him, two men from the Aviation Conduct Division reviewed the audio log in silence, their headphones pressed tight, their eyes unreadable. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air lingered faintly, clean but not comforting. His hand was wrapped in gauze, the bandage firm but not constrictive. Blood no longer seeped through, but the sting beneath it pulsed with every heartbeat, a reminder not of pain, but of purpose. He had endured worse during boardroom battles, mergers with higher stakes than stock prices, but nothing had ever drawn blood like this. Lieutenant Varine, the lead investigator, removed his headphones and set them carefully on the desk. His face was square and still, lined with the calm discipline of someone who had seen too much and judged only when necessary. He clicked a pen open but didn't write anything down. "You knew it would end this way?" he asked, not accusatory, more curious, like a man trying to understand the shape of another's restraint. Kieran met his eyes. His voice was low, measured. "No, but I knew what not to do. Panic." The second officer, a younger analyst named Dent, looked up from the transcript. "The restraint is impressive," he said almost reluctantly. "You didn't retaliate even after being injured." "I did retaliate," Kieran replied, the corner of his mouth twitching, almost a smile, but not quite. "I just waited until the right moment made it undeniable." Outside the glass-walled room, movement stirred in the hallway. A uniformed officer passed, phone in hand, whispering fast. Another one leaned over the front desk to speak with a man in a blazer holding a stack of legal papers, probably from the airline's crisis team. Even without opening the door, Kieran could feel it. The situation had left the aircraft and entered the bloodstream of the airport's internal system. Something was spreading. News, maybe even panic. And, somewhere behind it all, Vera Air's damage control was likely already in motion. Varen turned toward the mounted screen on the wall and replayed the final 30 seconds of the recording. Darren's voice echoed, tinny but clear. "He was supposed to just stay quiet. I didn't mean for it to go this far." That one line. It hadn't been intended for any ears but Darren's own conscience, a whisper to no one and everyone at once. And now it was evidence. Varen exhaled, slow and deliberate. "This changes things." Kieran leaned forward slightly, the edge of his sleeve brushing the table. "It doesn't change what already happened. It only reveals it." Varen paused, then gestured to the folder Dent had open. Social media's already lit up. Passengers posted clips. Some from when Hale was pulled back bleeding. One caught you sitting in your seat, holding your hand like it was no big deal. That footage is being shared fast. The narrative's forming. Kieran's eyes flicked toward the folder. "And what does the airline say?" Dent answered. "Nothing officially, but their legal counsel is on site. Word is they're preparing a statement suggesting mutual aggression. That you escalated things midair." Kieran nodded once, unsurprised. "Then they'll have to ignore what's on record." Varen's jaw flexed as if he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he studied Kieran again, this time not as a passenger or potential threat, but as something harder to categorize. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he said finally. "Not this exactly, but battles, strategy." "I build systems," Kieran said simply, "and sometimes you have to tear one down first." The air grew heavier with understanding. Outside the office, more officers gathered. Someone tapped urgently on a tablet. The footage had likely reached the media. Kieran could almost feel the pull of narrative taking shape, one that no longer fit inside Vera's polished safety manuals. Dent frowned. "There's a team coming from the airline to speak with you. Our protocol says you're not obligated to respond today." "I'll listen," Kieran replied, "but I won't explain what they already heard for themselves." From the corner of his eye, he saw an officer pull a pair of reporters away from the hallway. They weren't supposed to be this deep in the airport, which meant the situation wasn't just internal anymore. The door creaked open briefly as someone passed by, and Kieran caught the sound of a news anchor's voice playing from a phone. An altercation involving a CEO and a flight attendant, now under federal review. He closed his eyes for a breath, not from weariness but to catalog the pieces. Every clip, every statement, every silence that followed. He wasn't interested in vengeance. That was messy, unpredictable. What he sought was exposure, clear, clean, and final. Varen stood. "We'll compile our findings and forward everything to the Civil Aviation Ethics Board by morning. I suggest you keep a low profile until they contact you." Kieran stood as well, straightening his jacket, the fabric still stained near the cuff. "That depends on how low the truth decides to sit." Dent looked confused. Varen didn't. Outside the security office, Kieran walked past the press without flinching. Cameras clicked, a few shouted questions. He said nothing. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was precision. Words, like recordings, had weight, and he was saving his. By the time he reached the exit, airport personnel had begun redirecting traffic. Screens displayed Flight 612, incident under review. There was no footage shown. Not yet, but the voices had started online. The algorithms were humming. Kieran knew what came next. Narratives against narratives. Truth distorted until it frayed. But he wasn't afraid. He'd been here before, just in different suits and different rooms. As a car pulled up to meet him, Varen's voice echoed back in his mind. "They'll call it mutual aggression." Then his own words, sharper now, still true. "Then they'll have to ignore what's on record." He wasn't angry, he was focused. He had faced mergers more dangerous than this. Only now, the currency was truth. Injustice doesn't vanish. It recalculates until someone audits it. He snapped the buckle at the CEO, shouting in front of passengers who watched in disbelief. If you believe respect should never depend on rank, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't shout. It speaks calmly. "Do you understand what you've done?" Preston Lorne's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The sterile interrogation room inside Vera Air's operations hub was cold, deliberately so, designed to keep the nerves exposed. Darren Hale sat at the center of it, eyes flicking between the polished table and the blinking red light of the recorder in the corner. His uniform was wrinkled, his name badge slightly askew. The bravado he once wore like armor at 36,000 feet had disintegrated somewhere between the runway and this room. Darren's voice came out rough, defensive. "I was under pressure. You know how it is up there." The passenger, he was non-compliant. Difficult. Preston didn't blink. Non-compliant? He tapped a manila folder in front of him. "You dragged a metal buckle across a passenger's palm." Deliberately. That's not enforcement. That's assault. Darren fidgeted. "It wasn't like that." There was turbulence. "I slipped." Preston opened the folder slowly, revealing printed transcripts and still frames from surveillance footage. These were taken from the rear-facing camera mounted in the overhead panel above row 3A, he said flatly. "You weren't checking the latch. You weren't even steadying yourself. You looked right at him, gripped the buckle with your fingertips and raked it across his skin like you were opening a package." Darren leaned back, blinking fast. "Look, I was told certain passengers needed firmer handling. I didn't mean to hurt him. It got out of hand." "Firmer handling," Preston echoed, the phrase sour in his mouth. "By whom?" Darren hesitated, realizing the hole he stood in was deeper than expected. "There's been talk. Some memos. People upstairs don't like it when passengers challenge crew authority, especially high-profile ones. They see it as a media risk. They want us to maintain control. And slashing open someone's hand with a seatbelt buckle is what you call control?" Preston's voice remained low, but each word landed harder than the last. Darren's shoulders sagged. "I didn't know it would go that far." I snapped. "Wrong," Preston said, his tone suddenly quiet. "You didn't snap. You planned it. You escalated every step, and now the whole country has seen the buckle locked between your teeth." The silence that followed was heavy, humming with consequence. Darren looked smaller now, shrunken by exposure. "I wasn't trained for this kind of pressure," he murmured. "Vera throws us into the air with half the support we need and all the blame if it goes wrong. You think this is about one guy? No, this is about bad training, about psychological strain, about years of—" He stopped mid-sentence, catching himself too late, but Preston had already heard what he needed. "So, you're admitting there's a deeper issue?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Darren's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to the door. "I didn't say that." "You did," Preston replied, "and now it's in the record." The chief investigator leaned back, and for the first time, his composure cracked, not with anger, but with dawning horror. The puzzle pieces clicked too easily. Darren wasn't just a rogue element, he was a symptom of policies quietly written, selectively enforced, and now exposed in blood and high definition. Preston stood. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Your badge, your access, hand them over." Darren obeyed slowly, placing his ID on the table with trembling fingers. His mouth opened again, but no words followed. The silence was enough. Later that evening, after the emergency board meeting concluded in a blur of hushed voices and legal panic, Preston returned to his office alone. He poured himself a glass of water, but didn't drink it. The weight of what he had witnessed settled on his shoulders like frost. The memos, the footage, the confession, and now, Kieran Maddox. He opened his laptop and hesitated over the keyboard. Then, with a steady hand, he typed a message. It wasn't an official notice or a corporate apology. It was a request for a private, off-the-record conversation. To Dr. Kieran Maddox. Subject: Request for confidential discussion. The cursor blinked. He clicked send. Sometimes corruption doesn't crumble, it confesses when it senses a stronger truth. Kieran didn't wait for a receptionist. He walked straight through the glass doors of Vera Air's towering headquarters, his shoes tapping sharply across the marbled floor. The lobby was sterile and quiet, too quiet for a company in crisis. A security officer gave a quick nod of recognition and gestured him toward the elevators. When the doors slid open on the 12th floor, Preston Lorne was already waiting. His suit was less pressed than usual. His eyes underslept. They didn't shake hands. Preston led him down a narrow hallway, past a series of closed conference rooms, until they reached a quiet boardroom tucked in the corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, but neither man acknowledged the view. The moment the door shut, Preston pulled a remote from his pocket and flicked on a screen embedded into the wall. "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice low. Kieran stood beside him, arms folded as Preston played the footage. It wasn't passenger cell phone video or the cabin security feed. This was internal, high definition, silent, with multi-angle overlays. The moment played out. Darren leaning close, gripping the seatbelt buckle, the exact slash motion across Kieran's hand, deliberate and unprovoked. Then the next clip appeared. A digital document filled the screen, a memo, dated 2 weeks before Flight 612. At the top, RE, Enhanced Protocol for Non-Compliant High-Profile Travelers. Below it, a note from a regional manager named Barrett Voss outlined troubling instructions. Dr. Kieran Maddox is classified as a risk to service authority. Assertive enforcement may be necessary. Record deviations but maintain chain-of-command narrative. Preston paused the screen. His mouth tightened. Kieran stared at the memo, not in shock but with a cold, rising clarity. So, I wasn't just assaulted, he said quietly. I was profiled. Targeted. Labeled. Preston exhaled. We didn't know this existed until yesterday. It was buried in a private directive folder, bypassing senior review. He looked down at his hands. Darren didn't act alone. He was following a culture we allowed to take root. The room felt smaller now. Kieran stepped back, the silence swelling between them like pressure before a storm. This goes beyond one flight, Preston, he said. It's systemic. I know. Preston reached into a folder and slid a document across the table. A settlement agreement, confidentiality clauses, a 7-figure offer, apologies written in legalese. This is what the board wants. It's clean, quiet, ends everything. Kieran didn't even glance at the paper. A secret apology doesn't heal a public wound, he said, lifting his eyes. Your board wants damage control. I want accountability. Preston hesitated, clearly torn. You'd be going up against the company in full view. That won't be easy. They'll paint it as personal vengeance. Then let them try, Kieran replied, because it won't be personal. It'll be structural. I'm proposing a formal investigation, public, transparent, and reform measures overseen by my foundation. There was a long pause. Preston's face shifted, no longer defensive, but haunted. They'll never agree. Then they'll learn, Kieran said. You don't fix a cracked foundation with wallpaper. You tear it down and rebuild it. Preston rubbed the back of his neck, eyes heavy with conflict. You could still walk away. Let the noise fade. Kieran stepped forward, tapping the memo on the screen with 2 fingers. I didn't bleed just to let this get buried. Outside, the hum of the city continued uninterrupted. But inside that room, the tide shifted. Preston finally nodded. Not with enthusiasm, but with surrender. I'll bring it to the board. And I'll tell them the alternative is worse. Kieran turned toward the door, the faintest glint in his eyes. Not of victory, but purpose. His objective had evolved. This wasn't about clearing his name. It was about clearing the runway for everyone who would come after him. As he walked away, his voice echoed back to Preston without turning. Revenge rebuilds nothing. Reform rebuilds everything. The footage played on repeat. Every major network broadcasted the same loop. Kieran Maddox seated calmly, a blood-soaked napkin pressed to his palm, while attendants scrambled in the aisle. The split screen showed Darren Hale moments later, restrained, disoriented, the locked seatbelt buckle still glinting between his teeth. Narrators spoke over the images with varying tones. Some called Kieran's response measured and restrained. Others raised doubts. Was the CEO's retaliation justified, or did he cross a line? The nation had opinions, and none of them waited for facts. Kieran watched in silence from his home office. The curtains were drawn, the room dim except for the glow of the screens in front of him. He didn't want attention. He wanted accountability. Attention faded. But records, paper trails, evidence, they lasted. He leaned forward, unrolling a printout of the airline's passenger conduct policy, highlighting key sections. Loopholes stared back at him like open wounds. That night, Mason Redden sat across from him at the kitchen table. The attorney's tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, legal pads spread before him. We have leverage, Mason said, tapping one page. You've got public support. You've got footage. Settle while you're ahead, before the airline spins this into a PR duel. Kieran didn't blink. Settling is silence. It's protection, Mason corrected. You're a public figure about to finalize a billion-dollar merger. One wrong move could shift investor confidence. Kieran pushed the papers aside. If I hide behind silence, I'll be no better than them. His words hung in the air. Across the room, data analyst Roland Miles hunched over his laptop, piecing together a pattern from archived passenger complaints. Dozens emerged, cases dismissed under vague terms like passenger escalation, attitude infraction, or seatbelt non-compliance. The more they dug, the more specific the profiles became. "Look at this," Roland called, his voice edged with disbelief. 37 complaints over the last 2 years, most from minority professionals, all dismissed. Not a single one escalated to investigation. Mason stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "This is a pattern. Not misconduct, this is policy dressed in ambiguity." The doorbell rang. Preston Lorne's name wasn't on the visitor log, but the envelope he left at the front door was unmistakably his. Inside were printed memos, stripped of headers but not content. Kieran opened them slowly, each line cut deeper than the last. Passengers flagged as non-compliant profiles should be managed through preemptive posture authority. Assertive engagement encouraged for Class C behavior incidents. De-escalation is not mandatory when dealing with disruptive identifiers. He closed the folder, his jaw tight. "They wrote it down," Kieran said, barely above a whisper. "They actually wrote it down." The next day, the first leak hit the news cycle. A redacted memo made its way to a media watchdog blog, then another to a civil rights reporter. Within hours, national news outlets caught wind. By evening, the headlines shifted from passenger altercation to airline under fire for bias allegations. A graphic showed a timeline of similar incidents, including the infamous duct tape incident from a year prior. Inside Vera Air's corporate tower, chaos bloomed. Executives held emergency calls behind glass walls. Legal teams scrambled to track the leak, but they couldn't stop the tide. Meanwhile, Kieran worked quietly. He contacted affected passengers, organizing affidavits. He built a timeline of systemic failure. He forwarded his findings to the Aviation Conduct Board. He said little to the press, and that made them listen harder. In one interview, a former passenger, an investment banker named Jordan Reed, spoke emotionally about being labeled uncooperative for requesting assistance after a spilled drink. "I didn't realize I wasn't the first," Jordan said on air. "Now I know I was just one more in a list they never intended to fix." That quote, clipped and shared, ignited a movement. Protests formed outside airport terminals. Activists carried signs with seatbelt buckles drawn across slogans like "Secure Truth" and "Fly with Dignity." Still, Mason pressed him. "You've got the evidence. They'll offer a bigger settlement now. You could fund 10 startups and never deal with this again." But Kieran shook his head, flipping through a dossier Roland had just updated. The weight of it wasn't money. It was memory. He opened his laptop, staring at the paused frame of Darren's smirk before the slash. Beneath it, a file named Policy Refusal Final sat ready to send to the Congressional Committee. "Preston's risking his job to leak this," Kieran said. "I won't bury the truth just to protect my comfort." Mason sighed, hands on his hips. "Then we go public." "Fully, we already are," Kieran said, standing. "Now we make them answer." The hearings were announced that evening. The Department of Transportation, prompted by mounting public pressure and substantiated reports, scheduled an inquiry into Vera Air's conduct policies. Subpoenas were issued. The airline's CEO was called to testify. So was Darren, and so was Kieran. As reporters shouted questions through a storm of camera flashes outside the Capitol gates, Kieran emerged from a black car, briefcase in hand. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, but his calm was unmistakable. The story was no longer about a bleeding hand or a buckle in the mouth. It had become a reckoning, a chance to hold something broken up to the light. And somewhere inside that Capitol, Preston Lorne sat in a waiting room with his own envelope of documents, ready to say what he had never dared to before. Because when denial runs out of air, truth takes flight. The hearing chamber at the Federal Civil Conduct Tribunal was packed. Journalists lined the back wall with cameras aimed and fingers ready. The panel of adjudicators sat elevated in dark walnut chairs, their expressions unreadable behind their glasses and notepads. A hush fell over the room as Kieran Maddox took the stand. There was no stumbling, no hesitation, just the quiet resolve of a man who had endured enough and was now ready to speak. Kieran adjusted the microphone in front of him, the bandage from his healed hand still faintly visible against his brown skin. He wore the same bright blue suit from Flight 612, the very one stained with blood on that day, now dry-cleaned but symbolically untouched. His eyes scanned the room, not for sympathy, but for certainty. On April 17th, he began, his voice level, I boarded Vera Air Flight 612 with the expectation of reaching Novan City. Instead, I encountered hostility, humiliation, and violence, not from a stranger, but from a uniformed crew member. Gasps murmured through the crowd. Preston Lorne sat in the third row, his head lowered slightly, jaw tense. Beside him, Mason Redden, Kieran's attorney, nodded subtly, his presence quiet but vigilant. Kieran continued, recounting the events of the flight with clinical precision. He did not embellish. He did not accuse beyond what was proven. When he reached the moment Darren Hale slashed his palm with a seatbelt buckle, the room stiffened. Some averted their eyes. Others leaned forward, transfixed. Then Kieran reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the smartwatch. He set it on the table, turned it slightly toward the panel, and tapped play. The courtroom filled with Darren's voice, first the false accusations, then the cruel mutterings, and finally the panicked confession. He was supposed to just stay quiet. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Silence fell again, but now it carried weight, heavy and undeniable. One of the adjudicators, Judge Renlow, cleared his throat and leaned into his microphone. Mr. Hale, would you care to respond to what we've just heard? From the defendant's table, Darren Hale stood slowly. His face was pale, the arrogance long since drained from his features. I didn't mean for it to escalate, he said, voice trembling. I was following management guidance. They told us to maintain authority, to deal with disruptive passengers. We were told to be firm, to assert ourselves if passengers didn't comply quickly. Judge Renlow narrowed his eyes. You interpreted that as justification to cause physical injury, Darren stammered. There was pressure. Expectations. We had to hit certain conduct enforcement metrics. I didn't think— No, Kieran interrupted gently, voice unwavering. You didn't think. You obeyed. The room absorbed the statement like a blow. All eyes turned to the panel of corporate representatives from Vera Air seated just behind Darren, regional managers, legal advisors, and the head of operations. Their expressions ranged from stony to panicked, but none of them spoke. That was when Preston stood. Though not called to testify, he stepped forward, holding a folder in both hands. Your Honors, he said, offering the documents. These are internal memos I retrieved before my suspension. They reference specific passengers, categorized under compliance risk profiles. Dr. Maddox was one of them. One of the panelists flipped through the papers, eyebrows raising as he scanned highlighted phrases. Assertive re-education protocol. Discipline escalation strategy. Service control prioritization. It was damning. The airline's counsel scrambled to mitigate. These were poorly worded internal documents, not official policy. They were never intended for implementation. But they were implemented. Mason Redden cut in, his tone polite but pointed. They weren't just implemented. They were encouraged. The judge raised his hand. Enough. The panel convened in a short recess, and the room buzzed with murmurs and shaken heads. News outlets already drafted headlines in real time. Systemic misconduct at Vera Air confirmed. Passenger restraint exposes corporate corruption. When the tribunal returned, the head judge read the verdict without theatrics. We find Darren Hale guilty of first-degree passenger assault. We further find Vera Air in violation of multiple federal guidelines concerning discriminatory profiling, abuse of authority, and internal coercion practices. A federal penalty will be levied, and oversight measures will be enforced immediately. There was no applause, only stillness. Darren sank into his seat, hands trembling. The board members of Vera Air stared ahead, expressions unreadable. Kieran simply stood, gathered his watch, and looked at the judge with quiet composure. This was never about revenge. It was about correction, he said, each word deliberate. His voice didn't rise, but its weight filled the room. Sometimes the quietest testimonies echo the longest. The room was plain, white walls, no windows, just 2 chairs and a table that reflected the harsh overhead light like a stage too clean for comfort. Kieran sat alone, fingers loosely folded, his healed hand resting atop the other. The faint scar that ran across his palm caught the light now and then, a reminder of pain that had become purpose. The door opened and Darren Hale stepped in, slower than expected, shoulders hunched, the weight of months etched into the drag of his feet. Kieran didn't rise. He watched. Darren looked nothing like the man from Flight 612. The arrogance, the precision, the performance, it was gone. His once slick uniform had been replaced with a plain gray jacket and an expression carved by sleepless nights. He sat across from Kieran but didn't speak right away. For a moment, the room filled only with the soft buzz of the overhead lights and the rustle of Darren's nervous breathing. "I appreciate you agreeing to this," Darren said finally, his voice brittle as if unused. Kieran didn't reply. He let silence do what words sometimes couldn't. "I didn't come for forgiveness," Darren continued, eyes fixed on the tabletop. "I know I don't deserve it. I thought I knew what control was. I thought asserting authority made me powerful." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "But you showed me restraint is stronger." Kieran's expression didn't change. His gaze remained steady, clinical almost, like he was reading not a man, but a pattern, a system that had cracked. Darren looked up, searching for some reaction, any sign of anger or compassion. But Kieran gave him neither. He had learned long ago that offering either would imply a debt, and he owed Darren nothing. "You lost everything," Kieran said calmly, "not because of me, but because you never knew the value of what you had." Darren nodded once, almost a flinch. "I wanted this job so badly I let myself become something else. I followed policies I didn't understand, enforced rules I didn't question. I convinced myself it was loyalty." His eyes glossed. "Turns out it was cowardice." Outside the room, the world moved forward. A federal oversight panel had begun reshaping Vera Air's internal structures. Preston Lorne, once buried in bureaucracy, had resigned and rejoined, this time as a public advocate, leading workshops on transparency and empathy. The Maddox Accord, founded only months earlier, was no longer just a statement, it was a platform, a growing movement for reform in the airline industry and beyond. Kieran had declined interviews, speaking only through his actions. His foundation partnered with regulators, conducted research, and pushed for policy revisions that were already being adopted by 2 other airlines. And still he returned to his office every day, not to rest on laurels, but to ensure that no one mistook this for a moment. It had to be a momentum. In the sterile room, Darren rose slowly. He didn't extend his hand. "Thank you for letting me say what I needed to say." Kieran stood, mirroring the motion with solemn grace. He stepped close, not to intimidate, but to deliver his final word with clarity. "Learn from what you broke." That was all. Darren gave a faint nod and turned to leave, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have. Kieran didn't move for a moment. He remained still, alone again with the hum of the room and the lingering scent of disinfectant. Later that evening, back in his office, Kieran sat by the window as dusk fell across the skyline. His suit jacket hung on a nearby chair, sleeves still rolled up from a long day of back-to-back meetings. On his desk rested a small, clear case. Inside it, the twisted seatbelt buckle, cleaned, preserved, and displayed not as a trophy, but as a lesson. He reached for it but stopped halfway, his gaze falling instead on his open palm. The scar had faded, but not disappeared. That was the point. Outside, the city lights blinked to life one by one, casting long shadows over his desk. He leaned back in his chair, the fatigue of reform heavier than any courtroom battle, and yet he felt no bitterness, only clarity. Victory, he had come to understand, wasn't a ruling. It wasn't public praise or headlines. It was prevention. It was waking up each day and knowing that someone else, someone seated on a plane, someone wearing a name tag, someone following orders, might choose better because of what had been exposed. The scar on his hand caught a final glint from the desk lamp before he turned it off and stood to leave. Tomorrow he'd review new policy drafts, meet with union leaders, and finalize legislation recommendations under the Maddox Accord. But tonight he allowed himself one moment of reflection. Every wound that heals still remembers why it was made. A year had passed since the buckle locked between Darren Hale's teeth, but time had not dulled its sound in Kieran Maddox's mind. It echoed sometimes, not as trauma, but as transformation. On the surface, Vera Air no longer resembled the corporation it had once been. Under federal supervision, its colors had changed, its board restructured, its charter rewritten. But deeper than branding or boardrooms, something else had shifted, something harder to measure: culture. Inside the orientation hall of Vera's newly inaugurated training facility, a large screen came to life. It wasn't glossy footage or corporate cheer. The video began in silence before Kieran's calm, deliberate voice filled the room. Dignity can be lost or restored in a single act. Trainees, mostly young male recruits in Navy uniforms, watched with stillness. The footage didn't flinch. It showed a scarred hand, a courtroom recording, and a restrained man in a galley seat. Then Kieran's voice again. It wasn't the pain that changed me. It was the lie, and the silence that allowed it. No one spoke until the lights rose. Back in his office overlooking the skyline of Novan City, Kieran stood motionless by the window. Letters sat stacked on the edge of his desk, each one unopened but not ignored. He already knew what they said. Some were from passengers, fathers, travelers, students, men who thanked him for a reform they didn't know they needed until it happened. Others were from attendants who had witnessed misconduct but never dared to speak. Your story gave us permission, one had written in blocky script. Now I know that silence is not neutral. Behind Kieran, framed in a custom glass box, the original seatbelt buckle lay cradled in velvet black. The same piece of cold steel that had sliced his hand now gleamed softly under ambient light, as if repurposed by time itself. Roland Miles stepped into the room quietly, holding a tablet with the latest updates on the Accord's expansion. Europe wants to model their reform on us, he said, and the Aviation Board in Faroth just requested access to our training modules. Kieran didn't turn around. Good, he said. Make sure they use the full version. No edits, no softening. Roland nodded, then added, There's one more thing. The Council wants to name the policy charter after you. Kieran exhaled through his nose, an old habit that signaled reflection, not pride. I didn't bleed for my name to be engraved, he said. I bled so no one else would have to. Roland quietly exited, leaving Kieran in the fading light. He walked to his desk, brushing his fingers along the scar that ran diagonally across his palm. It no longer hurt, but it had never stopped speaking. Every negotiation he'd entered, every reform he'd pushed, had been guided by its voice. It was the reminder he carried, not of what was done to him, but what he chose to do afterward. A soft knock broke the silence. Mason Redden, his attorney and friend, peeked in. "Boardroom's ready." "The Inter-Asia delegation is waiting." Kieran nodded but lingered a moment longer. His eyes moved from the skyline to the buckle. "They're going to ask how it all started," Mason said from the door. Kieran finally turned. "Then I'll show them." As the office lights dimmed behind him, the scar on his palm caught one final gleam, like a constellation only visible in twilight. The hand that bled built something no blade could ever cut again. He tried to restrain a leader and ended up bound by his own actions. If you believe truth always finds its way through noise, subscribe now. Because justice doesn't buckle under pressure. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the strength to reclaim dignity in the face of cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on equality, accountability, and the courage to stand up to injustice.